Anfechtungen. 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 The young man had been struggling with what is known in German as Anfechtungen. That is the anxiety of soul and spirit as he sought to be right with God, not knowing the way. Anfechtungen. As he was studying to become a monk, he hoped that he would be able to save his soul. And what Martin Luther decided to do was to go beyond what was prescribed to make sure that he would attract the attention of God and that somehow calm his terror-stricken heart. Anxiety of soul. That is the anxiety of soul and spirit as he sought to be right with God. How can I become right with a holy and a righteous God? And what Martin Luther decided to do was to go beyond what was prescribed. Sometimes Martin Luther beat his body. Martin Luther sometimes starved himself days on end in fasting, all to become right with God. If he visited enough churches, if he burned enough candles, surely then his existential spirit of torture would end, all to become right with God. And Luther would begin to confess his sins, and then he would reach into his soul and he would begin to confess, sometimes 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours at a time, seeking solace, hoping that through confession his sins might be taken away. He had reached an impasse. Maybe there were some sins that he had committed that he failed to remember. What if there were some things he did that he didn't think were sin, but God thought they were sin? He had reached an impasse. Because Luther understood more clearly than most that God was absolutely holy, God was unapproachable, and the question was not whether the sin was little or big, or even a small speck could keep one from a holy and an awesome God. The question was not the size of the sin, the question was whether or not it had been forgiven. As he looked into his own heart, he discovered it was not just that he committed sins, but that he was a sinner. And he learned that his entire nature was corrupt. How do you deal with that? For Luther, confession was something like wiping up the floor when the faucet is running. Martin Luther was about to sink into despair. He knew that God's standard was higher. How could he possibly stand before a holy God when it seemed to him he had done everything and yet was unsure that he had satisfied God even in one particular point? How do you become right? Become accepted by God. The year 1511, he was asked to go to the little town of Wittenberg, and Martin Luther was chosen as a professor at the university. Staupitz said to him, Luther, what you ought to do is to stop teaching philosophy, but you ought to begin to lecture on the Bible. And so Luther began a serious study of the Bible. As he read the Psalms, he was impressed by the fact that so often the psalmist was casting himself upon the mercy and the gracious forgiveness of God without any attempt to please God or to think that he had pleased God through his good works. Then Luther got to the book of Romans. As it is written, the just shall live by faith, by faith, by faith, by faith. Because by the works of the law no flesh will be justified in his sight. Now suddenly he saw the light. Justification means that God declares us to be righteous. It is the declaration of God, so that when Jesus died on the cross, our sin was placed upon Christ, and that explains why Jesus cried, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" But not only was our sin placed upon Christ, but Christ's righteousness is credited to us, so that we are wholly and totally received on the basis of Christ's merit and his righteousness. And he read in chapter 3 of Romans, being justified as a gift by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. Justified as a gift, declared righteous by God despite our sinfulness. Now it doesn't make the slightest bit of difference how high God's standard is, because it is Christ who meets God's standard, and I don't have to. Finally, rest. He had met the requirements of God, or more accurately, he had met the requirements because he trusted Christ wholly, trusted Christ wholly to meet those requirements for him. Said Luther, "Thereupon I felt myself to be reborn, and to have gone through open gates into paradise."